Hi guys, welcome to today's session. This is the third in a series just covering a really simple exercise, which is a great way to learn how to paint realistically. And it's just painting a piece of fruit. So you can either work along with mine, there's a link in the videos for all this series to this lemon reference that I've been painting from that I took myself. Or you can work from your own fruit, anything will do, but just a single piece of fruit to keep things nice and simple is all you want. And ideally just a single light source as well, so similar to this where we've got one bright light source illuminating the scene. If you can, it's best to work from life, or tends to be easiest to work from life, so I highly recommend that. But it's totally fine to use a photograph as well, if you find that easier. So we're going to get straight into painting today. We're using the same palette and same materials that we had last week. So we've got some cadmium yellow, which is useful for the lemon. I've already got some white out on my canvas. Burnt umber as well. I'm going to find my burnt umber, which is good for sort of a warm grey brown. Ivory black, I've already got some out, and then I'm going to pop out a little bit more Prussian blue. We're using the Prussian blue a little bit with the lemon just to give that kind of cool yellow that lemons tend to have. That sort of basic palette will work. If you're working with a, like say a red apple or something, you're going to need some local bright reds rather than bright yellows, or as much bright yellow. An option for a muted yellow is something like a yellow ochre. So just kind of like play around with whatever you've got available in terms of palettes, but that's the palette that I'm using. And as much as possible I'm trying to keep it really simple, the local colours that I'm painting. So this week we're going to just carry on sort of developing the form of this lemon and get a little bit more specific with the sort of outside contour of it. So you can sort of see in the reference this little sort of bulge or those sorts of little shapes. They're sort of absent from my painting at the moment because I sort of kept it super simple last week, just keeping everything really simple as it builds up. But this week we can go back in. Now everything's roughly established, we know what colours we're putting where. We can start to adjust stuff, push some of the tones, like I'm going to go a bit darker I think with some of these shadows as we go. So kind of making adjustments to what we've blocked in is the idea. So the first week was just getting a wash drawing down, figuring out where the shapes go. Second week was establishing a sort of approximate version of this scene. And then this week we're going to be sort of developing the forms more specifically, and next week, which will probably be the final session, we're going to be working on texture. So starting to try to give a little bit of a sense of this sort of dimpled texture that the lemon has and the shininess of it. So that's our general structure. So this should be our penultimate session. I'm going to begin using medium. So again, I've just got a little bit of oil mixed with mineral spirits for my medium. And I'm just going to oil in. So sometimes, and it's happened a little bit, the painting will what's called sink in. So it goes a little bit flat as it dries, the oil paint. And you just need to kind of spread over as thinly as possible just a layer of the medium that you're going to be using on the day. There, just to resaturate it. I'm also going to zoom in so you can sort of see the lemon there. So that's what I'm working from, and you'll have the access to the reference from the video anyway. So I'm just going to zoom into my palette and my painting, just so you guys can focus on that. I don't want you guys to necessarily have to not be able to quite make out what's going on as much, just because the reference is in view as well. So that's a bit better. I might just lift the exposure a little bit too for that lemon. So there we go. In terms of brush sizes, I'm going to be using a mixture of slightly softer brushes this week. So I've got this sort of medium-sized long flat synthetic brush, just like an acrylic synthetic brush. And I'll probably be using this small one as well quite a lot, just to kind of work on the smaller portions. So the first thing I want to do is go in and just sort of refine the edge of the lemon a little bit. So we've got this, we ended with this sort of smudged edge last week. So we're going to go back into the smudged edge a bit and just kind of redefine it. At the same time, I'm keen to sort of just slightly darken the background, I think, behind the lemon, so that that background there, it seems a little bit too light. So I know last week I just used a mixture of black and white, so I'm going to go back to my ivory black, pick up a little bit more white, a little bit of white, and then mix up a new background color. Yeah, that's a bit better, a little bit darker than what I had before. And I'm going to start with the big brush, but when I need to, I'll swap down to the smaller brush. So these sorts of edges, for instance, up here, I'm happy to kind of do just using the broad brush, trying to get a little bit more shape into it, but it doesn't have to be super detailed. But once I get down to here, it's going to be the smaller brush that I hop back to. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of that color mixture I made using the smaller brush, and then just use that a little bit more closely. Just up to that edge. I'm going to do the same thing up here. Might mix up just a little bit more paint, but just matching that original pool of paint that I had. And got this sort of form of the little bulge at the back of the lemon, angles back in quite a lot. And then we have a kind of more steep carry back up to the top of the lemon, which probably going to have to extend the shape of the lemon up a little bit. So that's what we're doing this week, just making these adjustments. So I'm a bit happy with that overall shape of the top of the lemon now. And I'm just going to take, at this stage, I'm going to take another smaller brush, mix up a little bit of the sort of lemon yellow colour, top of the lemon yellow colour, which, if I remember rightly, had a little bit of Prussian blue mixed in, maybe not quite that much. And then it was moderately pale, so we'll see how that is. It's not too bad a colour. Possibly a little bit bright. So just dull that down slightly with a bit of burnt umber. And I can use that to paint back up into that edge that I just worked on as well. So start to catch some of those more subtle ripples at the edge of the lemon. And particularly sort of here I wanted this little fold that comes back down. So mix up a slightly darker yellow tone. Start plotting in some of these halftones as well, which we will work on a little bit more near the end of the session. But just as we're kind of near this boundary, it's worth starting to look at those as well a little bit. Yeah, that's not too bad. So I'm now going to drop down into sort of more of the shadow form. And I'll clean my brushes off a little bit. So I've got a little bit of mineral spirits that I'm using to clean a piece of kitchen towel. So keep them, get rid of that kind of greeny yellow. So if I mix the greeny yellow with the grey, it's going to make a sort of green grey, which I don't want. So make sure my brushes are reasonably clear. And I can mix up a slightly lighter grey for that floor colour. This little bit in here. Again, thinking about the boundary of that lemon, and I want to go a bit darker, so I want a bit of a richer shadow underneath the lemon. At the moment it's a bit greyish, could do a bit more punch to it, particularly near the very base of the lemon, needs to go a bit darker. So that tone's about the same as what I had before. So I'm going to push a little bit darker now. Almost like a pure black glaze, so I'm just taking pure black, mixed with a reasonable amount of medium, and I can use that in a similar way just to define the bottom shape of this lemon a bit more and darken the shadow, which I wanted to do. So I'm sort of killing two birds with one stone with that little pass. So that's pretty good. I maybe go even just a little bit more pure black right at the base where it's really dark. That's pretty good. And then a slightly lighter colour, which I can just paint into the shadow edge, and it's gonna just create a softer boundary, so more of a sort of penumbra, softer penumbra, which is that diffuse shadow that you get when a cast shadow is quite far away from, well, reasonably far away from the object. So generally the closer the object moves, or close the object casting the shadow is to the surface it's casting the shadow on, the sharper it'll be. And then when the object's further away, it tends to make for a sharper, for a softer shadow, sorry. So that whole sort of edge of the lemon goes pretty soft there, so that's not bad. And I can now jump back into the lemon, and I want to go a bit darker with the shadow of the lemon as well. And start just by seeing what happens if I kind of just glaze a little bit. So this is just thinly painted on burnt umber. So that's quite good, maybe a little bit warm. So I'm going to then take a bit of Prussian blue, which is going to cool that off, and try that. That's maybe a little bit cool. So we're trying to find a kind of happy medium that is darker than what we've got there already. Particularly as the value sort of travels down closer towards the base of the lemon, that kind of curves back in, gets really dark, and meets that shadow underneath it. And I'm allowing myself to just patch these colours on. So I've kind of put some cooler colours, some warmer colours next to each other, and it sort of starts to create what's called a bit of a broken colour effect. So there's no problem with that. It's actually quite nice. You can mess around with it, you can blend them into each other, sort of starting to look a bit camo. But that's totally fine. You can sort of mess around with it, and a lot of what I'm doing is kind of mixing, like we did last week a bit, it's kind of mixing on the surface of the palette till we get what we want. There's this added dimension this week of using glazing, so we're kind of painting thinner over a pre-existing colour, whereas last week we were sort of applying a brand new colour. And we'll do a little bit more of this next week as well. We can start to sort of pull them together a little bit where necessary. And then as I start to work up to the shadow edge, again I can start to sort of alter its shape slightly, so start to put in those ripples that we get through the shadow edge. So it's not a totally unbroken shadow edge. Made a little bit of a smudge there. I'll just wipe that back. So I'm starting to get a little bit more shape into this lemon's edge, and I want to make sure I keep the bedbug line, so the very edge of the shadow, that's where the shadow edge meets the light. I want that to stay pretty dark, so it doesn't get kind of generally lighter. You usually get a sort of darker tone right up near the shadow edge as it meets the light, and then you get this sort of fill light underneath, which is the light reflecting up from the ground. So sort of this colour in here, so I can sort of start to paint just a little bit more of a yellow tone into there, just using more sort of burnt umber, cad yellow mixed together to create a little bit of a glow in the shadow. Gives the shadow a bit more life that way. And there's pretty much always a transition going on somewhere. So somewhere something is transitioning into something else, almost invariably in the painting. Now, if I want to mix up a really dark tone that sort of functions okay in the lemon shadows, burnt umber and Prussian blue make for a pretty okay sort of mixture of warm and cool. So they're quite useful. I'll just use them there for this little bit. So I'm now starting to sort of look for where is the shadow, where's the lemon a bit darker in the shadows and where is it lighter. And it's a bit darker down on this bottom right hand edge and sort of almost softens, disappears into the shadow below. And then it's a bit lighter up in this section here. and that's starting to work a lot more nicely now, that reflection. Could probably do still with like a little bit more up to this edge, going a bit darker so it feels a bit flat up against that background. As I say, everything's always transitioning somewhere. I forget the exact quote from Ruskin, but he talks about how important transitions are in nature. We want to kind of state them without overstating them. It's really important. So yeah, it's got a bit more sort of sense of volume feel to it now, that shadow. And I'll try just adding a little bit more, kind of pushing that core light a little bit further. Yeah, we're just about there now with this shadow, which will just leave us to do a little bit of work. Actually, I'm just going to try to mix up. I sort of see a slightly warmer shadow in here, so I've mixed up something just with more sort of like a burnt umber cadmium yellow mixture, which has a lot more warmth to it if it doesn't have any of the Prussian in it. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Down there a little bit as well. Yeah, I'm just trying to tone down. There's a few sections where it has a little bit kind of excessive greenishness, I would say, so I'm just trying to incorporate a little bit more, just patching in a little bit of the burnt umber. So when things feel a little bit too cool or warm, try to pick too sort of cool or bluish, you can try to pick a warmer tone to kind of battle against it a little bit if necessary. Yeah, that's pretty good. So I'm also gonna just get even more. Now I've worked a little bit more in the shadow and made that darker. I feel like the very deep shadow right underneath needs a little bit more of a boost as well, like some more black painted into it, which I can actually blend up. Certain parts of it I'll blend up into the shadow, the lemon shadow as well. Yeah, that's a bit better. It's okay if that's a little bit blurrier because it's sort of a part of the image we can't quite see closely into, so those sections of a painting will tend to be softer, or kind of the specifics of it will get lost a little bit. So it's always worth kind of bearing that in mind, a little bit like when we softened off the edges last week. So yeah, that's looking pretty good. So the final thing is I'm going to add some, kind of rework some of these halftones. So going for a sort of darker greyish yellow colour. Halftones generally are sort of darker, and then they also tend to go a bit greyer. So trying to mix the right balance, maybe a little bit of black added to the burnt umber and cad yellow. The difficulty being as soon as we add the cad yellow, it tends to kind of lighten things up, but that doesn't seem too bad. So there we've got that's an okay lemon halftone colour. So next week we're going to spend time kind of really developing these textures, but for the time being we're still just looking for that sort of form to turn. So just where it's kind of darker right up to that edge there, blend that into the shadow edge a little bit. So partially mixing up darker colours and then partially sort of blending them. So we're starting to suggest the texture without sort of insisting really strongly on it. We're going to talk about this a little bit next week, but the texture tends to kind of come through in the halftones, so the darker halftones where the form is turning from the dark shadow into the lighter tones. That tends to be where our where all the texture appears, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's the case. I won't go into it this week because we're nearly done and it's moderately complex, but yeah, that's not too bad. So you can sort of see that starting to turn out of the shadows a little bit. Could probably do with a little bit more, maybe a bit more kind of grey mixed in. Just to get some slightly darker the halftones there. I'm just trying to get this transition from shadow colour up into the lights to be a little bit softer in certain parts. I don't want to get too carried away, so I'm going to roughly leave it there. Just a tiny bit here as well, because we're going to go into that texture next week, so I don't need to touch it just yet. I'm going to keep all that stuff a little bit more distinct for you guys, just so it's clearer once we actually get to it. All those separate stages that we work on. So I'm just going to clean my brush off slightly. I'm going to do, again, a slightly lighter tone. So now I just want to pop in it's got a little bit of Prussian blue added to the CAD yellow and white mixture. just pop that in the center of the lemon. Because we can go a lot lighter as well with the center tone. So I'm just going to not work on it, but just get that plotted in this week. Trying to get the right balance of putting enough yellow into it that it sort of feels strongly like a yellow lemony color. But also keeping it light, so it's kind of, we're looking for a balance between white and yellow basically with this mixture. And it doesn't have to, again, it doesn't have to be super neatly transitioned down, so we can just pick up some of those more sort of half-tony colors and then just surround that lighter color with those. Paint them down towards those halftones we were working on, similar to what we did last week. So we're just building it up progressively in these stages. Do a little bit more chroma in that yellow, so I'm just painting some, in that lighter color, so I'm painting some CAD yellow into it. I want it to have, so chroma being sort of saturation, it was a little bit pale. If you just add white to things, they tend to kind of lose saturation a bit, so you have to find the right balance between, as I say, the pure CAD yellow paint, which gives it its zinginess, its saturation, and the white, which gives it its lighter value, and that's what we're kind of working with. And that's probably about sufficient, I think, for this week, getting all that stuff that we were talking about in. So it's not neatened up, that's what we're going to be doing. Next week we're going to be trying to add some more interesting sort of general textures into it. As I say, particularly along the darker halftones. And in the highlights we've got these sort of glowing highlights as well that we can work on. But yeah, for this stage, this is what you're aiming for. So something that just sort of extends what we worked on last week without going into detail. In the broadest possible sense, that's the idea. So every step of the way is kind of keeping things simple. Each step's manageable, and you can allow the painting to dry between each step. You don't have to sort of do it all at once, which is often tricky. Alaprima is always quite hard to work in. I do have some Alaprima courses on the channel that you guys can check out. I think there's actually an Alaprima apple maybe. But yeah, that's pretty good, I think, for what I was aiming for. Maybe just a little bit of a highlight down here on this little tip. And up here as well. Yeah, that's pretty good. So you can see there's definitely been a development. It's not sort of got its highlights. It's not got the sort of bright white texture. But it's definitely feels a bit more kind of fleshed out as a lemon. And it's sort of getting to a point where you could almost leave it, like if you didn't want to sort of totally embellish it. It's not a bad little study that has the kind of colours of the lemon and so on. And it's starting to get a decent sense of sort of three-dimensional form as well, which is good. But as a base, ideally, this sort of stage we're using as a base for kind of rendering over the top. I'm just using a kind of wiped off brush here just to blend a little bit. We don't have to worry so much about sort of softening the edges again. We might do a little bit of softening, but we're starting to get a bit more certain about the sort of shapes behind the lemon at this stage. So we don't have to be as vague as we were. It's kind of just, last week we weren't entirely sure about the specific shape, so you don't want to kind of go super sharp and then find out that one of these edges was going to change. So now we're a lot closer. Like, I'm fairly happy with this sort of general shape of this lemon, so I can kind of keep things a little bit crisper. We are going to rework the edges slightly next week just to kind of get the overlaps to make it feel like certain parts of the lemon are overlapping other parts. But yeah, that's it for this week. So I'm going to leave this to dry, so you guys can work your pieces up to the same stage, let yours dry, and then we'll be coming back next week and finishing this off. As always, if you can subscribe to the channel, that would be great. You can sort of see all the new videos coming up. There's a bunch of other content as well as my sessions that are available on the channel, so there's always lots to watch. But yeah, otherwise I'll see you guys next week.